Welcome to this GCSJ Research Talk, hosted by the Centre for Global Challenges and Social Justice at the Open University. Our topic today is Wrongs Not Righted. How might we think about repair? Our speaker is Catherine Hall, who is Emerita Professor of Modern British Social and Cultural History and Chair of the Centre for the Study of Legacies of British Slavery at University College London.
I'm delighted to welcome Catherine Hall to speak to us today. Catherine is Emerita Professor of Modern British Social and Cultural History at University College London. Catherine's groundbreaking work has significantly reshaped our understandings of British imperial history, of how ideas and relations of gender, class and race were made and remade within colonial contexts, and of the multiple legacies of slavery and colonialism. She's the author of numerous influential monographs and edited collections. These include her 2002 monograph, Civilizing Subjects, Metropole and Colony in the English Imagination, and her 2012 book, Macaulay and Son, Architects of Imperial Britain. From 2009 to 2016, Catherine led the important ESRC AHRC project, Legacies of British Slave Ownership at UCL, which explored how wealth from slave ownership was a crucial force reshaping British society and culture in the 19th century and beyond. The outcomes of the project included the creation of a major public database documenting the compensations paid to British slave owners following abolition. And together with colleagues, she published the 2014 volume, Legacies of British Slave Ownership, Colonial Slavery and the Formation of Victorian Britain. Her most recent monograph, published last year, is entitled Lucky Valley, Edward Long and the History of Racial Capitalism, and explores the perverse worldviews and racial imaginations that underpins plantation slavery in Jamaica in the 18th century and that legitimated emergent forms of racial capitalism. In 2021, Catherine was awarded the highly prestigious Leverhulme Medal and Prize by the British Academy in recognition of the enormous impact of her work across modern British history, particularly in the fields of gender, class, race and empire. Catherine is a long-standing friend of the Open University and recently authored a brilliant chapter on racial capitalism for the final year sociology module, DD318, Social Theory, Changing Social Worlds, for which we're very grateful. So we're really delighted to host her today and greatly look forward to her presentation. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Catherine, who is speaking to us today on the issue of wrongs not righted. How might we think about repair?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Kevin, for the very kind introduction, and to Kevin and Sophie for getting me here today, which I must say I'm very happy to do because it's a very familiar place for me. So, in the late 1980s, when I first started working on Britain's history in relation to race, the idea of reparations scarcely surfaced. The primary preoccupation of black and brown populations in the metropole was racism here at home. The New Cross fire in 1981 and urban riots in Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool and London had focused attention on the scale of police racism, underemployment and unemployment, poverty and systemic discrimination amongst black communities. Claims for rights were being made by second-generation black Britons, and there was a new interest in rethinking Britain's imperial history and its relation to the metropole. Pan-Africanism was growing after the post-Manchester Big Pan-African Conference in 1945, and the first Pan-African Conference on reparations took place in 1993. And that was the year that the language of reparations surfaced in the UK. It was also the year of Stephen Lawrence's murder. Bernie Grant, who was then the Labour MP for Tottenham, who had been the leader of the Haringey Council at the time of the riots on Broadwater Farm, co-founded and chaired the African reparation movement. He tabled a motion in the House of Commons, supported by Tony Benn and others, calling for recognition of the unprecedented and unpaid moral debt owed to African people, urging all those countries enriched by enslavement and colonization to review the case for reparations. At that time, the idea of reparation did not garner significant support. The British delegation to the United Nations Conference on Racism in 2000 refused to have it discussed. And as we've seen, the current Labour government is also attempting to refuse it. It was in 2007 that the history of slavery began to come home to a wider public in Britain. The bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade focused public attention in new ways, provoking a conversation about Britain's history. Tony Blair would not apologise for past wrongs, but supported a celebration of Britain's role in abolishing the trade in people. But how appropriate was it to celebrate abolition rather than remembering the 2 centuries of slavery? What exactly was Britain's relationship to the slavery business? It was in the wake of 2007 that Nick Draper, Keith McClelland and I launched the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at UCL. The historical orthodoxy was that race and slavery happened in the Caribbean and the US, not here. We aimed to unpick this together with the common sense understanding that abolition was effected by white humanitarians and had nothing to do with economic power. We used the fact that when slavery was abolished, slave owners received compensation to the tune of 20 million. We used that as our lens and focused on the Britons who benefited, identifying the individuals who received compensation, what they did with the money, challenging in that way the distancing, the erasure, and the disavowal of British involvement. We documented numerous individuals, the well-known names such as the Gladstones, but also the many widows and single women, who were approximately 25% of the successful claimants for compensation, who had inherited through their husbands and fathers and were living off the ill-gotten gains of their families. Compensation was used to invest in railways, merchant banks, insurance, and urban property, contributing to the emergence of Britain as the dominant global power in the 19th century. Houses were built, books and artworks purchased and displayed. The slave owners took their human and financial capital to the new colonies of white settlement, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, facilitating the further expansion of white power. They actively defended the political and economic interest of the planters over the next decades, arguing for indenture so that they could bring in new South Asian labour, lessening their dependence on the emancipated. They claimed to support emancipation, but worked hard politically and in their writings to reconfigure racial inequality. For when slavery was no longer there to secure it, how might it be secured? The findings of our 2 projects, the first on the compensation payments and the second on the longer history of British slave ownership in the Caribbean, are all available on our website and have facilitated numerous investigations by individuals and institutions of historic connections to slavery and the wealth and power it brought to Britain. It was the killing of George Floyd in 2020, however, and the scale of the worldwide response mobilized around Black Lives Matter, which shifted the parameters of the debates about race and history decisively. The drama of the seizure of the slave trader Edward Colston's statue in Bristol a statue which had been the subject of controversy for many years, and its dumping into the docks where slave ships had once been moored was an incisive moment. Statues have a weight and solidity. They stand on plinths. They look down at us. They conserve the past in the present, tell us what we should remember and what we should forget. The majority of the innumerable statues of white men across the country were commissioned in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, times when British dominance was being challenged by rival imperial powers and anti-colonial movements. The statues were then supposed to act as a continual reminder that white Britons could imagine themselves as both a race of masters and a master race. Now, however, there is a reckoning. Towns and cities, universities, museums, galleries, and major national institutions have had to face up to the demands of their staff and their publics as to their historic involvement in slavery. Knowledge about a history, it is recognized, is a necessary first step in tackling its long-term legacies. Britain, or parts of Britain, have woken up to the ugly history, particularly in relation to slavery. In the wake of decolonization, Brexit, and Black Lives Matter, there is no longer an accepted common sense as to Britain's imperial past. It has become a contested field politically and culturally. And despite the vigorous activities of the right-wing cultural warriors, the evidence of the recent survey of social attitudes demonstrates that there is a significant shift in Britain's attitudes to this island's imperial history. Less pride, more questions. However, there is also very contradictory evidence. The spectacular growth of reform, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black abuse on the streets. So we have a very contradictory picture of what is actually happening now in relation to race. The question of reparations, once dismissed as marginal, is now more present. These efforts to rethink the past in its complexity have involved significant new research, engaged historians, archivists, curators, and writers, and opened up questions for multiple audiences. Institutions and individuals have engaged in self-reflection, tried to think about the past, recognizing that it is not past, it lives on in the present. The Church of England is investigating its history in relation to enslavement alongside universities, colleges, and companies. For historians, there is much work to be done, tracking the traces and legacies of empire into the now can provide the evidence and the tools for people to think with, ponder questions of responsibilities that need to be faced if any reparative future is to be not only imagined but effected. As the celebrated South African lawyer and activist Albie Sachs has put it, we cannot rewind history, but we can recast the historical narrative. Britain's history in Jamaica, the focus of my research, is what in the heritage industry is described as difficult, something of an understatement. Catalogues of wrongs which have not been righted is closer to the truth. 4 moments have cast long shadows in Britain and capture aspects of Britain's entanglement. They illuminate questions of moral and political responsibilities and point us to why repair matters. 1655 was the starting point, Cromwell's expedition, the English claim for Jamaica, and the creation of a colony built on slavery. 1833 and 1838 marked emancipation. 1865 was the uprising at Morant Bay. Finally, 2018 and the Windrush scandal brought the issue home once more in a different way. Each moment carries a story of debates in Britain about race, power, justice, exploitation, and inequality. Okay, so these are my 4 moments that are going to be very brief. So the first is about the formation of a slave society from 1655 in Jamaica. In the late 17th and 18th centuries, white colonists worked to make a slave society, replete with hierarchies of race and gender in Jamaica, one designed to exploit the labor of captive African men and women in the interests of extracting maximum profits for what they all called the mother country. The lure was sugar, a crop which could not be grown in Britain, and from a luxury was becoming a staple of European households. Colonists relied on violence and coercion to obtain labor, name people as commodities, chattels, applying the rules of commerce, the market, and property to men, women, and children, defining blackness politically, economically, and culturally as difference and inequality. The enslaved cleared land, established plantations, grew cane, built works to harvest it, roads to transport it to harbours, ready to send it to London or Bristol for refinement. White colonists depended on the Crown to provide military and naval support in the face of internal, the enslaved black majority, and external enemies, the rivalrous empires of Spain, France, and the Dutch, who all surrounded Jamaica in the Caribbean. The colonists extracted promises of freedom for themselves from the Crown and the freedom to enslave others. In return, the duties they paid on their sugar and the taxes they raised on the island provided a major source of revenue for metropolitan governments, facilitating imperial dreams of warfare and expansion. A mercantilist system of trade privileged colonial products and British shipping. Colonists regarded captives as superfluous to West Africa, the place they'd come from, were kidnapped, captured, enslaved labor as disposable. These are all the terms they use, which may have resonance for us now. Less than fully human, and condemned men and women to a form of social death, their roots to kin, rituals, habits, cultures, and places systemically destroyed. They were denied the ability to form and keep families. Their children were claimed by their owners. Slavery replaced the essential bonds of kinship with capital. Possibilities of building new lives and communities were constantly impeded. This was indeed a catastrophic history, and one that has shaped the lives of generations. Colonial Jamaica was perhaps the most unequal place on the planet, as Orlando Patterson writes. Slavery was drenched in violence, rape an integral part, and tragically, the violence of the enslaver against the enslaved poisoned the relations of all. The slavery business produced significant wealth for Britain. It also ensured that metropolitan society was permeated with notions of racial difference. The notion of race, that races had particular and unequal characteristics, and that skin color was a vital marker, was firmly embedded after 2 centuries of slavery and colonialism. Edward Long's 3-volume History of Jamaica was probably the most influential text. Pro-slavers represented Black people as barbarians, savages, promiscuous, indolent, only working with the discipline of the whip. Abolitionists, in contrast, represented poor Africans as passive, childlike, the kneeling and enchained African appealing to the white father. Am I not a man and a brother, and in need of white civilization? The abolitionists dwelt on the cruelty and illicit sexual practices of white slave owners, designating them as not properly English. The figure of the humanitarian, granting freedom to benighted others, offered a much more appealing identity. Pro-slavers and abolitionists were united, however, in their conviction that Africans needed white guidance, that European societies had achieved superiority in every field, from political, social, and economic organization to the arts and culture. Hierarchies were natural, whether of class, gender, or race. For pro-slavers, racial characteristics were fixed in the body. Abolitionists believed that slavery had locked Black people into degradation. In time, it was hoped they had the capacity to become like us. Race had come to stay as one of the defining axes of the human. The figures of the white colonist and the Negro were staple figures of popular as well as political culture. The pattern was also established of a division between those who saw Africans as forever subject and those who worked to keep critiques of racist imperial policies alive and in the public eye. In 1833, my second moment, after 50 years of conflict, a major rebellion in Jamaica, huge popular mobilizations in Britain, and, as Eric Williams was the first to point out, significant shifts in economic organization and a turn to free labor, pushed the Imperial Parliament to abolish slavery. But emancipation did not make people free. The slave owners received compensation. The enslaved were no longer held as property, but consigned to apprenticeship. This was finally abolished in 1838, after further mobilizations and campaigns in Britain. But the power of the planters remained. Freedmen and women were subject to decades of poverty, limited economic and political rights. The plantation economy was regarded as sacrosanct in Britain. Jamaica was needed for its export crop, and the planters must be defended. Freed people responded vigorously, leaving the plantations, creating free villages in the hills, defending their rights over the provision grounds, which had been central to their survival in the plantation economy, appealing to the new stipendiary magistrates appointed from London, who were meant to replace some of the judicial powers of the plantocracy. Despite the continuous efforts of the planters to limit the franchise, freed men who were able paid the necessary taxes to give them a vote for local vestries or for the colonial assembly, seeking allies amongst those people of color, a growing brown middling class, who aimed to challenge white dominance on the island. Planter influence in the metropole ensured a steady stream of negative stories as to the doings of the Negroes, insisting on the exaggerated success narratives of the abolitionists as to the outcome of the great experiment, as it was called, of emancipation. The planters' tales of the ruin they faced, thanks to the African refusal to labor, were magnified with the abolition of protective sugar duties, long argued for by the free traders. In the wake of the great experiment of freedom, there had been widespread support for the emancipated Negro in Britain. But by the early 1860s, and this is my third moment, this had significantly declined. Attitudes at the Colonial Office had altered. Once solid support for abolition had been displaced by skepticism. The continuous stories of idleness enthusiastically circulated by the pro-slavery paper The Times, the pressure from the planters for more immigration in order to secure their labor, the economic decline and abandonment of many sugar estates, all contributed to a sense of failure about the island. Dissenting missionaries, once the enthusiastic supporters of the brave New World, were disenchanted with freed people's challenges to white leadership and the success of the group called the Native Baptists or Black Baptists, who had developed their own patterns of worship. Anthony Trollope's very successful travel book on the West Indies viewed Africans as having made, as he put it, no approach to the white civilization of his white fellow creatures, whom he imitates as a monkey does a man. If left to themselves, Trollope thought, Africans would slip back into barbarism. The so-called Indian Mutiny in 1857 had spread white terror as to the rage of natives, and the violence of its suppression provoked little criticism at home. In 1862, a sympathetic missionary noted regretfully that the cause of the Negro is losing ground. Racial antagonisms elsewhere across the US and New Zealand meant that the West Indian was no longer seen as a special case requiring particular support and consideration. The situation in Jamaica worsened in the 1860s. Cholera, smallpox, the free trade policies that had undermined the sugar plantations, which were already challenged by high costs and outdated methods, led to closures which deprived labourers of regular wages. Planters, despite a growing pool of landless and dependent labour, promoted immigration schemes and were regaining the control over labour, which they had lost in the wake of emancipation. There were soaring prices for imported staples from the US, which was locked in civil war. Protracted droughts were followed by floods, undermining local food production. The white and coloured elites were feuding over office and neglected relief measures. Demands for access to unused Crown lands were refused, for official policy was to always support the plantations at the expense of peasant proprietorship. The Lieutenant Governor, Edward Eyre, was incompetent and unsympathetic, the reintroduction of the treadmill a symbol of his practice. Local magistrates greatly misused their powers. A black and brown counter-public had nevertheless developed with its own press and political representation, facilitated, albeit with difficulty, by the limited franchise of black freeholders who were determined to claim their rights as best they could. A brown merchant, planter, and assemblyman, George William Gordon, emerged as a leader in Jamaica. The son of a white man and an enslaved woman, he had been radicalized by his conversion to native baptism during the Great Awakening of 1861-2, which swept the island as well as North America. Gordon was deeply troubled by the poverty and injustices he encountered. Paul Bogle, a black freeholder from Stony Gut in the district of Morant Bay, shared these beliefs and politics. Gordon was locked in very personal conflicts with both Eyre, who regarded him as his major antagonist, and the local officials and clergy in St. Thomas in the East, where he held property. In May 1865, Gordon called on all the descendants of Africa in every parish throughout the island to form themselves into societies and hold public meetings and cooperate for the purpose of setting forth their grievances. He expected support from those he described as our philanthropic friends in England, those friends of the Negro, as they called themselves, who persisted in drawing attention to the fate of the peasantry. An appeal was made by the poor people of the parish of St. Anne to the Queen Queen Victoria, highlighting their reliance on British power in the face of the colonial governors and their alliance with the plantocracy. "We believe ourselves British subjects," they wrote, and the monarchy offered them a possible avenue for redress. "We pray for the Queen. We were without fathers and mothers, but we have the Queen. We are in Jamaica, but we have no power. We have no hope here. All our power and hope is in England." The response from the Colonial Office was to insist on the necessity of working for wages. It was that alone which would improve their condition. A series of meetings were held across the island to formulate petitions and claim redress, reparation. Black people spoke of the difficulties they faced. Born free, their parents slaves, but now I'm still a slave by working from day to day. I cannot get money to feed my family, said James McLaren, who was one of the rebel leaders and was later hanged. Paul Bogle held a public meeting in Morant Bay and attempted unsuccessfully to lead a deputation to Eyre, who refused their petition. "You are no longer slaves," Gordon told them, "but free men." Distress and discontent exploded in October 1865 over a court case, and Bogle led a march into Morant Bay. The ensuing riot resulted in 17 deaths and the burning of the courthouse. Governor Eyre declared martial law and grasped the opportunity to get rid of Gordon. He was seized, summarily tried, and hanged from the courthouse in Morant Bay. The militia, British troops, and Maroons engaged in a frenzy of repression and revenge. More than 400 people were killed, over 1,000 flogged, numerous homes burnt. There was trouble when this was heard in England. A royal commission investigated, typical government act, but focused on the immediate causes and events, neglecting the wider context. The suppression had provoked a major controversy in England, but became locked into the question of the use of martial law. John Stuart Mill led the critics of what was called the Jamaica Committee, who were appalled by this example of British injustice. The figurehead of the Air Defence Committee was Thomas Carlyle, the prophetic and racist voice of mid-19th century England. The critics lost out. The appeals of the Jamaican peasantry were not heard. Mill reflected gloomily on the racism of British practices in the empire. He spoke of the overbearing and insolent disregard of the rights and feelings of inferiors, a common characteristic of John Bull. Jamaica became a crown colony. The planters abandoned their representative assembly rather than submitting to any democratization of the franchise. Black Jamaicans were virtually eliminated as a political force. The interests of the plantations were to remain paramount. Carlyle's vicious representation of the African, sitting contented beneath his pumpkin plant, knowing that minimal labor would produce plentiful food, and his evocation of a frightful and immeasurable kindling of black unutterabilities, his insistence that the Almighty had appointed black people to be subjects and that they must be compelled to work, were some of the lasting legacies of 1865. I'm going to make a big jump, which I could talk about, but there ain't time. Jamaica finally became independent in 1962 after long struggles. The context of that independence was a non-revolutionary political development, the adoption of UK forms of political life and organisation, a commitment to charismatic leaders, a national bourgeoisie, and continued economic exploitation, mainly then from the US. The attempt to create a West Indian Federation capable of counteracting both the UK and the US was undermined to the dismay of Norman Manley in Jamaica and the fury of Eric Williams, now Prime Minister of Trinidad. Small island nationalism played a significant part in this, but Britain's hostility to the idea of a regional power was also crucial. Williams had understood from the 1940s, as he explicated in his classic text, Capitalism and Slavery, that colonization was about the creation of wealth and power for Britain at the expense of the colonized. Abolition had facilitated new modes of capitalist development, depended on waged and so-called free labor. Williams believed that colonial history meant a debt was owned by Britain, and a golden handshake at the time of federation or independence, a significant capital grant, would provide some proper recompense. The British authorities, however, preferred weak, small, independent nations to an integrated regional authority and offered only a mean sum at the time of independence, continuing to blame those on the islands, those they had colonized, for what they called homegrown problems, inefficiency and incompetence. These were the 20th century versions of those discourses of African idleness and lack of industry, the necessity for white control and coercion, so central to racists, from Edward Long in the late 18th century to Thomas Carlyle in the mid-19th century and James Anthony Froude in the late 19th century. So then, the change, and from the 1940s, the well-known story of large-scale migration from the Caribbean, a new kind of homecoming. We are here because you were there. I thought, since today is for me a return to the OU, an institution that I worked for part-time in the 70s and have been connected with ever since, and that Stuart was here in this faculty in the 80s and 90s, that I would quote from him. In the wake of the Notting Hill riots and the moment of civil rights and anti-apartheid, Stuart was alongside Martin Luther King in 1961 and a South African anti-apartheid activist, Robert Rasher, in the Central Hall, Westminster. Stuart focused on British responsibility and spoke of the worldwide struggle for racial and social justice. It had now arrived in England. And this is the quote: "The same ships which took Africans to the US took Africans to the West Indies, which is my home. There was in those days a triangular trade. They sent out from this country beads and jewels for the natives. They took from Africa across the Atlantic human lives, not their souls or human beings, but the most effective and efficient human machinery. They sent back coffee and sugar. Now there is a different triangular trade. 300 years of economic and social neglect in my country has at last washed up in yours. It's your responsibility here and now to deal with the problems now confronting you. New legislation is being passed, only thinly described as non-racial, closing your doors to people who've suffered at the back of your empire for 300 years. Now, we either live together or not at all." This was a different kind of responsibility from that which had faced Britons in the late 18th century and early 19th century, when the concern was with far distant plantations and peoples. The legacies of slavery were now on the doorstep. It was the presence of a significant African Caribbean population in the late 20th century that signaled the transformation of a politics of race and repair, with the demand that racism here as well as over there, had to be confronted. The decades of struggle since then have been well documented in these last years by the explosion in Black British history. Then in 2018 came the Windrush scandal, exposed by the excellent investigative journalism of Amelia Gentleman for The Guardian. Thousands of British people were wrongly identified as illegal immigrants, many deported or imprisoned, summarily sacked, their homes repossessed, cancer patients denied treatment. The government spoke with two voices, actively creating a hostile environment on the one hand, while claiming to be an inclusive nation on the other. Many still await compensation, struggling with the complexity of the appeal system and the lack of legal aid. They continue to fight for justice, but at least 44 people have died leaving, having submitted their claims. Not met. Windrush descendants were not understood as British. They were Black and from the Caribbean. Yet they had been British subjects from the time of emancipation. David Lammy, now our Foreign Secretary, spoke directly and eloquently to this history in the House of Commons. My ancestors were British subjects, but they were not British subjects because they came to Britain. They were British subjects because Britain came to them, took them across the Atlantic, colonized them, sold them into slavery, profited from their labor, and made them British subjects, and then denied them their rights. Such a brilliant speech. Sadly, a government post has shifted his politics. There is then a debt. As we approach the bicentenaries of 1833 and 1838, it seems a particularly auspicious time to reflect on this. Britain's historic debt is a moral and political one, but who is responsible? Is it the state? This is a possibility which is always denied in Britain. No government has offered an apology or any acknowledgement for slavery and its legacies, only regrets. Things seem most unlikely to improve with our current government. Lisa Nandy promised an end to culture wars and a commitment to an inclusive nation. Then came the cut in overseas aid. Given the empty treasury and the scale of repair to all public institutions that is needed, it seems that any turn to the state is unlikely to deliver. CARICOM, the regional organization that was established for the Caribbean, continues to lobby for meaningful negotiations with the relevant European states on the basis of legal claims and is currently revising their 10 demands. They keep on going. So if not the state, what about the individuals whose families are known to have benefited, the descendants of slave owners? A few have made some acknowledgement and offered donations. Others have insisted that was a long time ago and it's no responsibility of theirs. Should we then look to the institutions that profited, the banks and insurance companies, Lloyd's of London, for example, but they have made it clear that their efforts are limited to their own practices in relation to recruitment, employment and promotion. Many universities and colleges have instigated research to establish connections with the slavery business and have proposed modest investment in scholarships and perhaps changes in curricula, but these do not in themselves improve the experiences of students in the classroom or of staff. And as we all know too well, British universities are facing a disastrous financial situation. Museums and galleries are busy mounting exhibitions, but often rely on short-term contract workers to do the necessary research. Big exhibitions, however powerful in their immediate impact, have no guaranteed lasting effects on acquisition or interpretation. The danger is always that an effort is made and then attention passes to the next concern. Immediate investments were made in the face of public pressure, but soon terminated. Much is promised, but not all delivered. Windrush victims await compensation. Improving figures on diversity, ensuring increased representation of Black and brown people does nothing to tackle structural inequalities. They remain in place. A key legacy of chattel slavery was the forms of racialization that were locked into the mercantile capitalist system at every level. The African was destined to labor for the white man. The reorganizations of capital and labor that have happened since, from industrial capitalism to financial capitalism, today's reworkings of neoliberalism, we've seen many reconfigurations of racialization, but it remains central to Britain's economy, culture, and society. The problems are systemic. A long history of exploitation, extraction, and accumulation demands change. So what is to be done? How might we, the contemporary multicultural population of the UK, respond to events which took place centuries ago but continue to reverberate in the present, whether in terms of global inequalities or structural racisms at home? The white population of England and Wales is now approximately 82% and are not personally culpable for what happened centuries ago. We, the white we, those of us alive now, did not engage in the slavery business, but by virtue of belonging to a society that has historically benefited to such a degree, we do, I would argue, carry responsibility. We are not guilty of a crime. We are neither the victims nor the perpetrators of the evils of slavery, but we are beneficiaries of what was done as members of a society enriched by that system. In an attempt to move away from a focus on perpetrators and victims, the cultural critic Michael Rothberg proposed the concept of implication, exploring what the legacies of slavery mean today in terms of justice and historical responsibility. He argues that there is a need to develop a new category describing the implication of people in events that are temporally or spatially distant and in which they have not played a direct role. The term he uses is implicated subjects. But are we all implicated in the same way? Surely not. What about the differences between rich and poor, between white and black and brown? Britain was able to develop as a modern industrial society, in part because of the wealth and practices of racialization transmitted from the Caribbean. The slavery business nurtured Britain's manufacturing and service sectors and enabled the promotion of the human and financial capital necessary for new levels of growth. Slavery ended, but unfree racialized labor in the form of indenture continued across many sites, from Trinidad and Guyana to Mauritius and Fiji. White workers at home enjoyed a relatively high standard of living, enabled by those who were colonized. Britain had a welfare state and a national health service, which, despite all the depredations which have taken place since the 1980s, still mark a vast gap between conditions of life here and in the Caribbean. Underemployment and unemployment are still endemic in Jamaica. The drug trade fuels violence. The nation is burdened with debt from the interventions of the IMF and the World Bank. We in the contemporary UK are implicated in events which are spatially and temporally distant. This is the price, as Hannah Arendt would say, we pay for living with others. We all have inherited benefits from regimes of domination which we neither originated or control, for we inhabit societies of power and privilege and belong to a collectivity which has accumulated wealth over centuries, in part by the exploitation of colonized people. What is more, until there is a significant change, we contribute, whether we like it or not, to the persistence of these long-established patterns of inequality, reproducing the everyday conditions of possibility for systemic racisms and new reconfigurations of neoliberal capitalism. So who is responsible, and who's to judge who is responsible, and what does responsibility mean? Is it a moral responsibility or a responsibility to act? Doesn't recognition require action to have meaning? How? These are the questions. I have no answers. As a historian, I try to uncover the truths of the past, truths which have still not been addressed, and the legacies of which run deep into the present. Recognition is an essential component of repair, but recognition without action will not bring repair. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this GCSJ Research Talk. Please subscribe to this channel, follow us on social media, or visit our website to learn more about the GCSJ Centre and future events.